today's guest lecturer at UCSD Transnational Korean Studies here at UCSD is Albert L. Park, the Bank of America Associate Professor of Pacific Basin Studies at Claremont McKenna College, or more specifically, Claremont College. Dr. Park is the co-author of EnviroLab Asia, which is funded by Henry Lucy Foundation and its initiative at the Claremont College with very generous amount of $1.5 million. I hope it's okay to say the figuratively, that carries out research on environmental issues in Asia through a cross-disciplinary lens. He is the co-founder and co-editor of Environments of East Asia, which was a multidisciplinary book put out series from Cornell University Press that covers environmental issues and questions of East Asia. He also serves as an associate editor for the Journal of Asian Studies. So he's got fingers on many different areas. He is the recipient of 4 Fulbright fellowships for research. Is that a record? Maybe. An ABE Fellowship, which is the Social Science Research Council and Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, and fellowships from the Korea Foundation and the Center for East Asian Studies at University of Chicago. So I gather Professor Park is very good at writing proposals and grant proposals. A native of Chicago, God bless him to come to Southern California from the cold, windy winter of Lake Michigan. He received his BA with honors from Northwestern University, a great university in Chicago, everybody knows, right? And MA from Columbia University, and must have enjoyed New York City life. A PhD in history from the University of Chicago, so back to Winterland. That's a quite impressive academic record. As a historian of modern Korea and East Asia, his current research project focused on the roots of environmentalism in modern Korean history and its relationship to locality and local autonomy. This book project is tentatively titled as Imagining Nature and the Creation of an Environmental Movement in Modern Korea. He is the author of Building a Heaven on Earth, which is subtitled as Religion, Activism, and Protest in Japanese Occupied Korea, and is the co-editor of Encountering Modernity, subtitle Christianity and East Asia. So Professor Park has interestingly have mixed religion and agriculture. And I think that you may have, and this is that for many of you, that might sound unusual combination of a relationship, but you may have already read the synopsis of this lecture, but it may be good for me to read it again, because I think you'll begin to understand why that relationship is so important to his work, and also Korea and South Korea. For it's important to notice that he begins with an understanding that agriculture has been the driving force behind environmental decay and destruction in modern Korean history. Now, this is probably not only for Korean history, but it's probably for any countries that have gone through the modern industrial development, including in agriculture. The degradation of the environment through the sculpting of landscape and water bodies for farmland and the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides has been a process that has caused division between human, non-human, and the rural and the urban. And here, especially good to notice that Korea has one of the most important, what do you call here, mud flats that we share with China, and that has been tremendous resource for food, seafood, and culture and Korean cuisine. And that has been largely greatly diminished by building reclamation land project for farming. And this is also one of that example. Through this lecture, he will map out the ecological and spatial rifts caused by the systemization of agriculture. In laying out this process of division, his talk will present a story on counter drives to state-led approach to agricultural developments, specifically in the history of organic farming, cooperative movements, and self-sustaining passive political history in Korea and South Korea. It specifically looks at their approach for the creation of assemblages that would give way to an ecological order that moves toward a human and non-human collaborative historical trajectory for the Korean peninsula. And so we welcome his ecological and rural movement through his research. So let's welcome Professor Albert L. Park.
Thanks, Kyung. Thanks for that very generous introduction.
Sorry, it was too long.
No, it wasn't too long. It was very generous. I appreciate it. Kyung and I have gotten to know each other really well because we're especially working on a project for the Vienna Biennale. So I always enjoy seeing Kyung, and I always enjoy seeing other friends here too. And I appreciate everyone coming on a Thursday afternoon, at least in California, and spending time over Zoom, because like you, I'm sure I'm very tired of Zoom and I really don't like using it anymore, but it is the medium that we have to use right now. And so I will try to give a very condensed version of my talk. I'm going to read a bit off of my talk. Sometimes I'll just talk very freely, and then I'll leave for Q&A. And I'm really looking forward to your comments and anything else that you wanted to say about this project. So, okay. So let me share my screen. Okay. Then get here. So, okay. All right, so let's get started here. So agriculture destroys the environment. Destruction is defined as the action or process of causing so much damage to something that it no longer exists or cannot be repaired to its original state. And the history of agriculture has shown that agricultural production tore up environments to the point where the present human and non-human conditions no longer reflect or embodies the past. Destroying landscapes through agriculture has given way to all sorts of environmental concerns. The exhaustion of soil fertility through intensive farming and chemical fertilizers, chemical runoffs that pollute water, livestock produce methane that contributes to greenhouse warming, climate change, the poisoning of human and non-human bodies through chemical pesticides, and the annihilation of complex ecologies. The destruction of the environment through agriculture has been driven by temporal orders of the modern era. Whether it be Hegelian or Marxian, Modern historical totalities have shaped and determined the non-human world through this construction of new spaces to achieve the highest stage of human development, which is the modern. Human growth and autonomy have been at the center of these historical totalities or temporalities that ultimately value nature or non-humans as raw materials for the refinement of humanity and their unfolding into a supreme form. The materialization of these modern temporalities through spatial production has been a magnified process of altering, disrupting, and reconfiguring the patterns and rhythms of non-humans for a future of growth in the areas of human enlightenment, wealth, and prosperity. So modern historical totalities arrived on the Korean Peninsula in the late 19th century. These temporalities captured Korean intellectuals and leaders. It captured their minds really well. It was from this point on that the anxiety of falling back and the need to catch up specifically to the West, which in their minds had achieved modernity, started and quickly drove the transformation of the environment. To be part of and to reach the end stage of these historical totalities, it was necessary to spatially reconstruct Korean agriculture, which was the bedrock of Korean wealth at the time. In other words, they had to modernize it. So Koreans, with the help of American and British, began the modernization project in the 1884 model farm. Supported by Kim Ko-jong, it was unlike any farm at the time. Seeds from the US were planted. Its landscape of fertile crops looked like any landscape that you'd find in the United States. It featured livestock, technology from the West, and most importantly, the government asked Americans and British figures to oversee the farm. The 1884 practice farm marked the beginning of a new era of agriculture. It was a real break from past customs, conventions, and norms. Instead of sustaining a moral economy and a mutual relationship between humans and non-humans, agriculture and the environment was seen as something that needed to be employed for the creation of national wealth and for becoming modern. So today, I'd like to introduce a new story about the environment in modern Korea that ties together temporalities and spatial production. Deviating from standard narratives of environmental history of Korea, it's a story on destruction and renewal through stages. Collectively, the stages tell a story of laid down layers, the spatial dominance and reconstitution of nature for the materialization of the modern temporal order and the contemporary quest to break these hegemonic temporalities and create a new ecological order of mutuality of being. This talk is based on my current research, as Kyung mentioned, on the origins of environmental thought and movements. I'd be happy to give you more details during Q&A about my research, as well as fill you on the details that I may have missed in my talk, okay? So, stage one, stage of replication. So up until the 19th century in Korea, agricultural cultivators forged landscapes that you could say were carefully integrated, functional mosaics that retain much of the wisdom of nature. They were based on close observation and imitation of the natural order. This is a quote from Donald Wooster. Influenced by civilization and enlightenment thought that authorized humans as the dominant central force in history who should transcend nature, the chosen state sought to take hold of the changes in agriculture and further accelerate its pace of transformation. It pursued the commercialization of agriculture through industrialization for the purpose of Korea becoming part of, quote, the universal temporality of becoming modern. So, erecting a model farm stood at the center of these reforms to industrialize Korean agriculture. The concept of the model farm originated from the modern period. It served as a place of agricultural experimentation to advance farming knowledge and practices. In this capacity, it became a site to figure how to increase production, especially for the market. So the model farm concept really came from the United States and parts of the West as a way to modernize agriculture. It's a place of real experimentation that you can replicate in other places, the results. So following his trip to the United States with Korean government officials to learn about Western institutions and practices, Choi Kyung-suk established a model farm in 1884. Assisted by George Folk and given land, by the king, Trey envisioned the model farm as a site of agricultural testing and research, a place that would raise the same crops and employ the same knowledge, techniques, and tools that he personally witnessed on farms in Massachusetts and the Northeast of America. Trey aptly named his farm the American farm. He planted a variety of seeds that were supplied by the US Department of Agriculture, and he bred and raised native and foreign livestock and horses. The farm featured all the latest tools from the West, as I mentioned, including 18 different types of farming machines, including the latest plows in the United States. Generally, you could say the model farm was a significant biological, technological, economic, political agent. Also, first, it introduced non-native species directly from the West throughout Korea. Jersey cows, Shetland ponies, pigs, sheep, and bulls from California were raised on this farm. The first crops produced from the seeds coming from the US were allowed to go to seed. And then these seeds were distributed to 305 areas throughout Korea for them to, for peasants to grow themselves. Second, it promoted and spread the mechanization of farming based on Western methods. Third, the model farm framework introduced a method of farming that relied on outside knowledge and resources to experiment, replicate results, and increase production. It encouraged a scientific approach to farming that would lead to techniques and discoveries that would be applied to other areas of the country to produce results similar to what was achieved on the model farm for uniform production. Fourth, the model farm introduced a method of farming that called for top-down government supervision and intervention. So the centralization of development. Control would be exercised through uniform measurements and scales. And finally, and most importantly, it planned for the merging of the temporalities of human and temporalities of the non-human to accelerate agricultural transformation on the peninsulas. So many of you have taken probably basic biology classes and know how plants grow, but let me just spare a few minutes and kind of explain the importance of soil and nitrogen in this process. So plants, as you know, have their own temporal rhythms based on various factors. As some of you know, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium in soil are essential minerals for plant growth. The harvesting of agriculture pulls out these minerals every time. So various practices have been carried out to replenish them in the soil, including planting green manure, such as legumes and non-legumes like oats, engaging in polycropping, and letting land simply rest, letting them go to fallow. These practices help to build up soil organic matter and mineral supplies to create healthy conditions for plant growth. Replenishing minerals and strengthening soil organic matter takes time. Hence, plants have their own, you would say, the temporality, their own pace. Right? The model farm, however, wanted to speed up this process of growth by experimenting on natural and chemical fertilizers and introducing various types of technology that would enable quick growth. The pace of the non-human world needed to keep up with the hurried pace to become modern. So outside norms, instead of domestic traditions of farming, served as the guiding lights on how to move lands from a rude to a more refined state and become thoroughly controlled, productive environments. The norms would underlie a process that would give way to a less biodiverse environment that was more productive, like those in the United States. But in the late 19th century, if you know anything about US history, land in the late 19th century was very unproductive. Soil was very, very unproductive because of over farming and overuse. And in America, what they simply did was they left the farms and went to another place to farm. So, so in the late 19th century America, it wasn't necessarily the model place for farming in terms of soil regeneration. So. Stage 2, power. So the Japanese colonial state in 1910 inherited and significantly intensified and scaled up this process of environmental alteration through agricultural replication for market production in order to export cheap agricultural products to Japan. Agricultural production on the peninsula was no longer tied to just bringing about Korea to make it aligned to modern temporalities, but also an indispensable motor for moving Japan forward toward modernity. This process of alteration focused on monocultural farming, especially rice. So the colonial state organized large-scale, top-down agriculture drives for increasing the pace of plant growth and scaling up agricultural production. These drives took under the watchful eyes of scientists at the Agricultural Experiment Station in Suwon, which is, you see right here is a photo of this agricultural experiment station. It inherited the features of the American model farm. The station was a factory for producing new agricultural knowledge and practices. Scientists at the station conducted surveys of the non-human world, cataloged native and non-native species, carried out agricultural experiments to boost production, did research on chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and shared its finding with the colonial government that used them then to create agricultural policies. Speeding up plant growth requires a real potent partner, and that is chemical fertilizers. Korea had a low soil fertility with a low pH and organic matter content and very low levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, particularly nitrogen. Low soil fertility stemmed from the high relief of the land and heavy downfalls of rain, which caused soil erosion and left it unable to mature over time. And if you know anything about soil productivity, it's really important to let soil rest. And if it's constantly moved around, the soil organic matter, the living things in the soil are disrupted and it becomes less productive. The colonial state relied on Japanese entrepreneurs to supply a great amount of chemical fertilizers in a short amount of time. Large-scale productions of fertilizers in Korea was carried out by corporations like the Japanese Nitrogen Corporation, the Chizo Corporation, which invested nearly 62.5 million yen in the construction of the Chosen Chizo Hiryo, or the Korean Nitrogen Fertilizer Corporation in what is today North Korea. The production of ammonia-based fertilizer, which included nitrogen, allowed for a steady supply of fertilizer for Korea and for using that fertilizer to speed up the growth of plants and crops. So Chizo's fertilizer factory in Hungnam, built between 1926 and 1929, used the Cassell procedure to produce ammonium fertilizer. At the time, there was two main procedures about how to extract nitrogen from the air. That was either the Cassell, which was an Italian procedure, and the other one was the Haber-Bosch, which was German. This procedure combined nitrogen and hydrogen through a high pressure process in a large steel barrel. And the Chizo Corporation bought the rights for that type of device from the Italian company and brought it over to Japan and then eventually to Korea. This method of producing ammonium required a tremendous amount of energy, particularly electricity, that led the company to build 3 hydroelectric plants in the northern part of Korea, which you see there on the screen. Alongside electricity, the fertilizer plants operated by Chizo in Korea required massive amounts of resources, such as coke, coal, carbide, which led to the establishment of other factories and mining projects. Chizo's Hungnam site was enormous, and this is a map made by the US government after 1945 of the Hungnam site of the Chizo Corporation. It included chemical plants, schools, dormitories, various types of factories. And it's right along the waterfront. Right? It produced a variety of goods. This is another snapshot of the Chizo factory. Right? You can see here it produced not only fertilizer, but other types of products. Right? And let's see. I would say that collectively, Chizo created a fertilizer industrial complex where resources were drawn from the land to a central location for the production of fertilizers and chemicals. This complex linked together the non-human and human entities to establish an instrumental landscape for exchange, production, and consumption. The fertilizer industrial complex introduced environmental change on two levels. First, it altered multiple landscapes, disrupting the biodiversity of soil with the nearly 570,000 tons of chemical fertilizer planted on farms by 1937, and coal and mineral excavations. Second, it disrupted land and water to create new space of pollution. It never accounted space where Koreans were wondering why things are dying, including fish. And why was pollution happening? Because they were simply, the factories were simply dumping the waste into the water. The industrial fertilizer industrial complex also produced a new regime of human pain. Factory workers and chisel plants encountered the raw state of nitrogen fertilizer, the white powder, as factory workers said, and the new experience of chemically induced pain. Their skin stung with pain. They had watery eyes. Their chests were burning. Their bodies were turning yellow, and they found they could not wash off the white powder. Lee Buk-myung captured the feelings and emotions of the factory workers and the deterioration of their bodies through his book, Chiso Biryo Kongjang, the Chiso factory, based on his experiences at the Hungnam factory. One of the protagonists in his book declared, quote, "The environment is eating away my chest." One must remember that there were no industrial laws protecting these workers, unlike industrial laws protecting factory workers in Japan for environmental issues. They weren't strong, but at least there were some environmental law. So the non-human and humans found themselves undergoing a gradual process of destruction. It was a process of monocultural replication authorized and led by a very watchful and commanding colonial state. An elaborate capitalist political economy lied behind this process as it tied together disparate entities and elements to forge a new space of power. In so doing, it forged environmental conditions where the human and non-human were treated in unprecedented, damaging ways. So, part 3, annihilation. Quote, "Korean soul is dead," close quote. That's what an American official said in 1945. So up until 1943, the colonial state pumped chemical fertilizer in the soil. By 1943, the usage of chemical fertilizers declined as chemical fertilizer plants turned to munition production, and most chemical fertilizers were sent to Japan. Soil in Korea rapidly declined without the steady input of nitrogen fertilizer. So once you introduce it, it becomes, I don't want to say addicted, but it requires that you constantly feed the soil, feed a nitrogen fertilizer for it to remain productive. And without it, then it loses its productivity. The infertility of soil led to calls for producing chemical fertilizers and pesticides domestically under Park Chung-hee, starting in the 1960s, who saw agriculture as a primary vehicle to cheaply feed the population during South Korea's push for modernization. Under Park Chung-hee's developmental plan, agriculture, fertilizer, and pesticides combined to produce the cornerstone of the new industrial chemical complex for South Korean fast-paced development that began a new assault against soil and the non-human world to control the non-human world. Toxic pesticides such as DDT, BHC, Parthion, heptachloro were pushed by the government to destroy pests that threaten crop production. If you read Rachel's Carson's Silent Spring, she talks about all these pesticides. And I will tell you, if you read them, they are nasty chemical pesticides, right? That, well, in a minute, I'll show you, have not only affect non-human worlds, insects, but also humans greatly. By the 1960s, fertilizer and pesticide plants produced enough chemicals to become a major exporter of them, especially fertilizer. So the state pushed chemical fertilizers and pesticides onto Korean farms. It supplied them through two ways: through Nonghyup, which is the National Agricultural Cooperative Federation, and the Semaul Undong. 농협 became the sole distributor of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And one thing I want to make kind of clear here, 농협 is often referred to as a cooperative. It's not a traditional cooperative. It is, back then in Park Chung-hee's times, a state-run organization that was used to carry out state plans of modernizing agriculture. And that means pushing chemical fertilizers and pesticides. The other way that they did it was through the state kind of pushed their ideas onto the rural area was through the Semaal Undong or the New Village movement, which started in the 1971. This was a movement to also push the production of certain types of rice, particularly the Tongye rice, and using chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides in a very intensive way. And all the villagers were told this is the way to improve their lives as well as to improve the nation. So the intense pressure to employ chemicals for farming gave way to multiple changes and developments in the ecosystem. So I'll break down to the non-human change. I'm sorry, I didn't go as the slide. I apologize for not going through. Talks about 농협, Semaal the Suwon Station actually turns into the Office of Rural Development in 1961. So it has this nice continuity from the colonial period. And even so, even late 19th century, all the way up into today, because the Suwon Station still exists. So what are the non-human and human changes that happen? So non-human changes. The organic content of soil steadily decreased during the colonial period, moving from 4.4% in the 1920s to 1.8% by the middle of the 1980s. It dropped so much that people were recognizing that soil just didn't have the organic matter needed to stand on its own, for soil to stand alone. So it needed these chemicals. Second, pesticides wiped out complex ecologies with different types of insecticides, fungicides, and so forth. So insects, fungi. So once you spray pesticides, and like particularly if you want to get some type of insect that's ruining the pear tree, right? You're not only attacking that insect when you spray it, you're spraying it, you're dispersing it widely. So other insects, healthy insects, particularly bees, right, butterflies, also get affected and die because of these pesticides. Third, toxins in the air and waterways just ravaged landscapes, waterways, and so forth. You found polluted farmlands. You found factories that were producing all these pollutants, the factories producing chemical fertilizers and pesticides, ruining farmlands right next to them. So what's the human impact? So from the first one, from soil, sickness from pesticide poisoning, such as here's Koen Suk, who had a known case of mercury poisoning in the 1970s. Right? So he was spraying mercury-based pesticides that then made him very sick. Second, you have the rise in cancer among farmers by the 1980s. So DDT, heptachlora, alderin, enderin, these are organic chlorine pesticides, have known connections to cancer. And so 1970s, they're spraying these pesticides. And over time then, you see farmers by the 1980s into the early 1990s who sprayed them intensely and often without gloves and protective materials, starting to develop cancer. Third, what's another human impact? They were farmers who were engaged in organic farming that I'll talk about in a second, were persecuted. They were called communists for wanting to do something very different from conventional farming. They wanted to organic farm. And the reason that they were called communists was because they were doing something different, and that wasn't abiding by the nation state, the standards of the nation state. So what happened generally was the corrosive decay, destruction, and death of soil and the human body. What you started to see in this period in the Park Chung-hee area and pushing into the 1980s was a rise of a capitalist agro-ecosystem. This systemization I like to say capital agro ecosystem or the systemization of nature. This systemization refers to the multifaceted process of incorporating non-human elements, nature, and the overall environment into the state's centralized agricultural system for food and resource production. It's been a process that then has led to control and domination of non-humans and humans in everyday. This systemization of nature specifically tied together chemicals, time, and space, uniting human time with non-human time, and rearranging landscapes and waterways to produce quickly achieved results for human growth and prosperity in the future. So the final stage, renewal. So I would say there was a counter narrative to this drive for establishing hegemonic temporality. And it arrived through organic agricultural food groups and cooperatives who formed a rural agricultural-based environmentalism since the 1960s, who were calling for a different type of historical temporality. So here, Yeonjae Paek is on the call and he knows these figures really well. So in fact, there's a picture of him that I got from one of his works. So there are three groups. There's Cheongneonghoe, which was an organic farming group, Punmo Hakgyo, which is a school that teaches organic farming, and Hansalim, which is an agricultural cooperative in South Korea. So the philosophy of these groups, generally speaking, viewed the world as one unitary organic whole with no independent parts. In large part, this view was derived from religious trends from the colonial period that spoke of the universe as founded and sustained by a single force, ideas particularly found in Tongak or Cheondeogyeong. Tongak, as many of you may know, was a religion started in the late 19th century and inspired a mass peasant uprising in the 1890s. At the center of the religion was the belief that everything, humans and non-humans, came from a single life force. So Tongak and later Cheondeogyeong leaders drew up moral and ethical practices centered on the mutuality of humans and non-humans. Inspired by Tongak, the 1989 Hansalim Manifesto, for example, announced that everything in the universe, including Earth, nature, and humanity, originated from a single source of energy that gives and sustains life. Everything in the universe, according to this manifesto, is interconnected. The ideal state of humanity, therefore, is one that, quote, respects symbiosis as a basic order of nature. For Hansalim, it is a symbiosis that stresses intimate human-to-human contact, which would enable the overcoming of all forms of alienation and the fullest development of personality. Yet it is not, quote, limited only to the relationships between human beings, but encompasses the relationship between animals and plants, inorganic substances, and even machines. Founders of the Hansalim, in particular, believe the responsibility for protecting all aspects of the world and ensuring a symbiosis lied with the people. So individuals should confront anything that causes conflicts and divisions. These positions led to a critical stance against industrial capitalism, or more specifically industrialization, because of its constant fervor for economic growth, which has only caused violence, destruction, and discord. A criticism best captured in the excerpt from the Hansalim Manifesto here. I'll read it. It says, the obsession for growth as a result has made capitalism and communism alike. Both the two have pursued only economic growth and technological progress, consequently centralized monitoring and control by technical bureaucrats and intensifying economic conflicts. This has also led to social imbalance, bringing about the degeneration of the environment and the exhaustion of natural resources. So the industrialization of the economy and life overall prevented a symbiosis in the world, particularly in the rural. Overcoming the state required the construction of a new life, or a 생명. In some ways, the concept of 생명 was similar and possibly derived from the concept of 생활, which was a concept during the colonial period that stressed the unfolding of a holistic being that was suppressed due to material conditions. There appeared to be a belief that the outcome of the construction of a holistic being would be an interconnected figure who would value, pursue, and sustain a balanced and symbiotic life. Both 생활 and 생명 were thoughts of as states of being that can only be achieved by addressing all aspects of a person's everyday life. Hence, if you look at Purmo School, Hansarim, Cheongneungwei, 생명 was linked to ecology or 생태. That is, the drive for building a balanced and interconnected life necessitated focusing on and repairing the totality of relationships between organisms and the environment. The rural and agricultural-based environmentalism that I'm presenting sought an ecologically driven social renewal for the birth of a new life. This drive for social renewal took place through the construction of a new system of interconnectedness. One important feature of this system was the push for environmental sustainability and the promotion of biodiversity through organic farming. And reconstructing different forms of production and exchange, particularly through cooperative economics, and something which I could explain more during Q&A. So, in conclusion, overall, I would argue that the system of interconnectedness that emerged in relation to the agriculture and rural-based environmentalism have tried to lay down a vernacular landscape in opposition to an official landscape in the rural. Rob Nixon here states that vernacular landscape is shaped by the affective, historically textured maps that communities have devised over generations, maps replete with names and routes, maps alive to significant ecological and surface geological features. A vernacular landscape, although neither monolithic nor undisputed, is integral to the socio-environmental dynamics of community rather than being wholly externalized, treated as out there, as a separate non-renewable resource. By contrast, an official landscape, whether that's governmental, NGO, corporate, or some combination of the two, is typically oblivious to such early maps. Instead, it writes the land in a bureaucratic, externalizing, and extractive-driven manner that is often pitilessly instrumental. The agriculture-based environmentalism that I briefly spoke about today are drives to build a new temporality or historical trajectory through a vernacular landscape. It's a new unfolding of history that emphasizes an ecological order anchored by autonomous-like assemblages, or I would say ALAs, where non-human and human forces autonomously interconnect to overcome divisions and establish balance. The ALAs have the means to try to flatten out hierarchy even between humans and non-humans, to create collaborative lifeways. These agricultural groups have seen the pursuit to form an alternative ecological order anchored by ALAs as the sites of transition from the established to the emerging. It's been a process introducing alternative systems of working and living through which people could simultaneously interrogate established values, customs, and institutions, and work out designs to solve problems caused by industrial capitalism. But most of all, creating ALAs is a pathway to restitch together humans and non-humans to form a new direction of Korean and human history. It's an active intervention in time to respect and protect non-human patterns of living and decenter humans as the central subjects of history. In essence, it's the pathway to opening new possibilities of new inclusive temporal orders and forms of spatial reconstruction. Right. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing. Okay. Now I'm happy to take any questions and answers that you may have. So,
Albert, can I ask you a quick question just because I have to leave?
Yeah, sure.
I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think it resonates a lot with many, not just social movements, but also academic work that's trying to make sense of human and non-human worlds.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, in your work, mostly you emphasize plant and human interactions.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering, like, do you also consider like animal and also like virus and bacteria, like the kind of cohabitation with those non-living forms. Like, I mean, yeah, that's just really, really important as part of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think I agree with you totally about the extension of this idea of human non-human relationships from the plants, vegetation to, let's say, animals in particular, because I think that's a key subject of study for a lot of academics and activists and so forth. And that's something that I am definitely interested in, animal treatment. I think more in the contemporary period. And it's interesting. So if you look at these cooperatives, and if you look at generally these organic food movements, and Yeonjae, feel free to interject anytime because you have always the answers. But there is still emphasis on eating beef, right? And so I've been really trying to think about how do they reconcile this idea of human, non-human interconnectedness, and they still eat a lot of beef. I was at a Hansaling plant a while ago, and I was seeing them cutting up, pigs, for pork production, right? And one way in talking with them that I think they try to reconcile it is, one, they try to think of it as, how are we going to basically produce our meat, in other words? So the question is, okay, we're going to eat animals, right? Which throughout history, many histories, we've had that relationship of humans eating animals. So we're going to do that, but how do we do it in an ethical, humane way? And I think that's where they try to bring up this idea of interconnected. So, for example, if you're going to slaughter cows, right, you do it in a humane way rather than in a very unethical way, right, where supposedly you can, do it without them being in much pain, right? You can use various types of mechanisms to make sure that it isn't this kind of disastrous kind of slaughtering of animals. So I do definitely see that when I talk to, especially with Hansaling, their livestock farmers, the way that they approach it is interconnectedness about how do we treat them throughout the process from life to death. But they don't reject eating meat. So I think it's about more the meats.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. But that's a great, I mean, I'm really fascinated with that aspect. How do you reconcile that, right? And I think that's how a lot of people reconcile too, even in the United States or anywhere, right? About we're going to eat these animals. So if that's a given fact, then let's treat them ethically. But the interesting thing is they won't just give that up, which is probably the best solution. Right? So the question is, why can't they break from that habit of eating beef, which we then know, at least in Korea as well as the United States, there's a cultural tradition around it, as well as economic powers, right? I mean, the cattle industry wants to push you to eat beef, but there's, like if you're in Korea, right? Eating beef is a social mechanism, right? So you remove that, what are you gonna use as a social mechanism? Like 된장찌개? I mean, no one's gonna think like that. So I think it's a real important issue that needs to be resolved by these groups, I think. There's a lot of contradictions, I think. Oh, Kyung, you're on mute.
Yeonjae, would you like to add something to what Albert responded? Okay. Junha, you had a question. Do you still have a question?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I guess I have a lot of questions. This is something that I'm really interested in. And okay, I guess like one thing that I was like writing down earlier was, so there's a lot of research going on about how diet affects the microbiome that we have in our bodies and how that in turn affects our mind and our body. Sorry. And I was wondering, how do you scale up from the issues of, creating Senghwa from Sengte and Sengmyeong? How do you scale that up into something that's more granular, such as, a relationship between humans and things that are invisible, like microbes, which is pretty vital too. Like what does that, progression look like, I guess, in these organizations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, if I was to take a stab of it, and this is not only these organizations, but generally thinking about it, right? When we think about the non-human world, right, we think of these immediacies, right? Soil, plants, these things are very visible. And as you mentioned, right, microbes are not very visible, right? And especially like soil microbes, right? I mean, the thing that I've learned about soil, and this is something coming from a historian, right? I was all about intellectual history, my first book. And I had to educate myself on soil. For me, soil was just dirt. I really did not value it other than, I knew it supplied the nourishment to plants. But if you look really deeply at it, soil, right? And you look at the soil microbes, right? The soil, the SOM, the soil organic matter, right? It's a rich biodiverse area, right? The soil, but it's not visible to the eye, right? And unlike like animals, right? Like a cow. And so I think for a while, like if you look at environmentalists, in I think generally speaking, your immediate attention is to anything that's visible, right? But I think you're seeing a turn, especially during the pandemic too, with recognizing, of course, that these bacteria and other types of pathogens really affect humans, right? And are very poor, they go through borders, they can't be stopped and so forth. I think what's happening is acknowledgement. And I think that's key, is acknowledgement about these microbes that you're talking about. And so I think, at least for environmentalists, there is more of an acknowledgement of it. Now, if you look to farmers and look at organic farmers, they are very conscious of the soil organic matter of SOM, right? So they already acknowledge of these kind of microbacterial life. It's very vibrant, and it's fundamental to life in general and vegetation, right? So I would say that organic farmers, were already very conscious of it, right? But the key question is, and this is the challenge, right? If you want to make a more inclusive environmental consciousness where you think not only animals, but you think about bacteria, how do you make people care about soil organic matter? That's very hard, right? I mean, to me, I've become really fascinated because I'm studying it, but generally speaking, no one really wants to study soil. And then they're not going to want to study like what goes on in soil when you realize it is the life of the earth. Right? So that's the biggest challenge, right? How do you make that jump to people caring about soil organic matter? And I think for academics or any activists, I think you have to frame it along connections to political economic issues, right? So look, soil organic matter, right? You might not care about it, but you should care that the state government in South Korea pushed all these chemicals onto farmers and made them, and really did force them to an extent, and some voluntarily, of course, but just destroyed soil to an extent, right? And so once I think you connect it to soil organic matter to state power, then people are like, oh, maybe I should study soil, right? So I think that's the key thing to do, is especially academics or any activists, is you have to connect it to material frameworks that restructure non-human pathways and non-human life, right? And I think that's what the organic food groups do pretty well. Some of the groups that I spoke of, and activists in Korea, I think are doing very well. The connection between soil, bacteria, political structures, economic structure, capitalism, and so forth. So I think that's the way, the approach that you have to take that I've seen, and that's the way, at least that's what I believe as well.
Yeah, and I guess another thing to add on to that is for a layperson to care about, invisible microbes, it's also a visualization problem.
Yeah.
Having media that's adapted, that's timely, and I mean, these are things that matter, and they impact us greatly. So it's just a matter of managing complexity, of making it easier for people to access this sort of complex relationship. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely somewhere.
It is. It is. It is. It's that's the great thing about environmental studies, environmental history. I mean, I would encourage you, I don't know what your background is, but the way that I learned all about this was just talking with scientists, right? And having that dialogue. That's what, we've been doing here at Climate Ecologists through Envirolab Asia. I talk really, most of my close colleagues now are scientists, right? Not that I don't like the humanists or anything, they're great as well, but the scientists offer this language that's a language that was very unfamiliar to me and made me see the world very differently, right? And once you connect that science to political, economic, man, that makes such a fantastic exploration, right? Calvin?
Calvin, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of wanted just to ask more about the intervening, into people's pedagogy and knowledge regarding these kinds of things. Because I think a lot of what your presentation today touched on, I'm doing an independent research project about how to democratize coffee and the issues of global supply chains, agriculture, socioeconomics. And I was wondering, you said that one of the best ways is to connect it to a material framework of economics and politics. I was wondering what you think about the viability of cultural intervention into, say, the cafe or the restaurant or the grocery store, where people go to actually consume the kinds of products that are being grown and worked on.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because that's where we see today activism is placed, is through consumption, right? Especially in the last, let's say, 20, 30 years, especially now, right? You consume to change the world, right? And, to be honest, I'm really on the fence about that direction, right? Martin Buber, who is a Jewish intellectual, he wrote The Pathways of Utopia, and it's a great book. And he talks about consumption as activism, and this was in the 1920s. Okay? And he was particularly talking about consumer co-ops. So consumer co-ops is a bunch of people getting together, pooling their money, and then buying products, right? And then going to that store, and you could buy products really at a cheap, more inexpensive than the regular store. And then Buber said that, if you really think about it, consumption is not an active process for political change. You're just buying, right, and consuming it without thinking about, for example, where it's coming from, right? It's a very passive form of activism, because all you're doing is just purchasing, right? Which is, if you think about it, it's already part of your everyday life, right? So Buber would say then what was necessary is you have to approach production, right? Which, so it then falls along the lines of a lot of arguments, right? Consumption or production as form of activism. And I tend to agree about the need to approach and deal with production, right? Means of production. So for example, your project about coffee, right? thinking about how coffee is produced is more important than I think about consuming if you want for environmental sustainability. So how are you going to grow it? You know, how are you going to form a cooperative to make sure that there be ecological practices and so forth? And what ends up happening is when you, and this is political theorists would say, when you approach things from the productive angle, it forms a different type of community from the consumer angle, right? I mean, consumer side, you could say, oh, we're all one in a community, right? But it's a very fragile, weak relationship. Whereas production, if you think about, let's say farmers, for example, right? Production often requires a lot of sacrifice, a compromise, right? And so it's pushing the individual towards cooperation and investment in what you're doing, more so than consumption. So that's why I'm a little hesitant about consumption. But I don't know, I mean, you know, there's a real challenge, right? In this technological age, right? Where we do see sometimes consumption does matter. Like, for example, businesses really care about what people think now, right? So the most recent example in the United States, right? When Georgia carried out, you know, those laws that restricted voting, right? Then Coca-Cola and Delta spoke out of it because they knew that people were getting really mad, right? And they were thinking, oh, these people are not going to consume our products, right? And we're going to have a bad image. So in that case, with technological, and that's really a lot to do with technological innovation. You have these social media campaigns, right? So to dismiss that, I think is really problematic. I don't think you can outright dismiss that. But in the long term, does that lead to structural changes? That I don't know. And that's where the dilemma lies, right? And I think this is, if you want to tie it back to Korea, I think that, you know, the groups that Yeonjae looks at, that I look at, really look at production really well, but they also look at consumption. And they want to look at both because it has to be balanced, right? If you want structural change. So yeah, that's how I would approach it.
Yeah, thank you. If I could hold off Kyung's raised hand really quickly, I have just a really quick add-on. Do you think that viability of intervening into production really changes upon like what is actually being produced? Like like right now we're kind of speaking in like general terms, but like if we go from like crop to crop, food to food, and so on, do you think there's like very big differences or maybe none at all in terms of the viability of that kind of thing?
So if you, are you asking like intervention in production, how much effect it has?
Well, for example, like coffee presents like a very polarized example of being produced exclusively in like the global south, very rural areas, and then being consumed in very much metropolitan areas like Seoul, which has like a ton of cafes per capita. Right. So that's like a unique example as opposed to something that has more local value, let's say, like a domestic meat production or something like that. So like the difference in local value, I'm wondering if that affects like the area of intervention, for example.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that locality matters in types of any type of process. I mean, again, looking at these movements, you know, Kyung, Yeonjae, and myself are working on this project. We're looking at this one village called Hongdong, right, in South Korea, which is a very good prime example of it's organic, mostly organic farming community where Pumo Hakgyoga is centered. And you do see the value of locality, meaning local exchanges and local production, and affecting that spatial area, right? Now, so in some sense, it makes sense because when you have these local forms of production, it affects the local community. Some things are reinforced, and therefore you have changes, right? So yes, I think that matters. Now, the biggest challenge I think for Pumo or maybe Hongdong, but they might not care, is how do you move it outside of the local to scale up the changes? That's the biggest challenge, right? If you care about making national change. Yeah. Kyung.
Well, I mean, some of the things that have been mentioned here, like for example, you're just talk about how to get us in touch with the dirt, the earth, right? And in some ways, that partly is a problem of visualization.
Yeah.
Right? Like in cases like back in the days when ozone was a problem, how do you visualize ozone that is invisible for people to see the problem? Right? That was the issue. And I think that like Hans Haliman Purmu and others who are engaging young people from the city to come to the village and to have more experience with rural life and get their hand on the dirt, and and that gives them a whole kind of let's say startling new experience that they haven't had before, right? But I think it's also about, that's great that direct contact is partly, but a lot of it is that it's the invisibility in different ways, or the, shall I say, more of a distance between consumption and production.
Yeah.
For example, like a friend of mine said, well, I saw a documentary about the chicken slaughterhouse, and after that, I decided to go to vegetarian, right? So, I mean, I actually need to see, probably should force myself to watch one of those on YouTube and just feel so shocked and so appalled and so sickened that I would never eat another piece of meat, right? And, and for many of the young people, I think one question was raised about what you eat. Like I'm at the age where it's too late. I ate so much bad stuff that I got all kinds of problems, right? So as they say, you are what you eat, and in that case, I think a Coca-Cola is basically that case in Georgia voting thing is such a hypocritical, because in reality, they should just shut their business down, because, or make something else that is much healthier. Because not only that you brought up the issues of all these chemical plants in North Korea back in Japanese period, but I mean, it's everywhere in the world. And that we are basically infected or suffering or diseased by the chemical agent from the factory, but we are all diseased in so many ways every day from everything that we consume. And in this North America, basically Mexicans, Americans are the fattest people in the world, neck to neck, across the border, And so I think that we need to somehow show, one is to, in terms of through educational media, to really show what a slaughterhouse does to every single person in this country, forcefully, right?
Yeah.
And then that the other thing is that when you think about it, what can make us to consume less, besides meat product, but in general, overall, consuming material stuff, right? Not just the food, but is that partly in terms of meat issue? I mean, there are religions that forbid you from eating meat.
Yeah.
And Hinduism, Buddhism, and in some extent is Muslim too.
Yeah.
And why could they be not involved, or why could we not engage that huge, voting population
Yeah.
that they have, and so on. But I have very simple, basic question: is that in Korea, you recycle food product, right? Domestically. Do they really use that for fertilizing? Do you know?
I don't know. I think certain food products, but Yunjae, do you know that answer? Recycled food as fertilizer? Oh, we can't hear you.
Also heard they recycle some of the food waste for animal feed. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know in detail either.
Yeah,
Like how much, or, because we have system here, recycle very little, right? Some of you might not know, in Korea, every food waste goes for every citizen in the country, goes into special boxes, so that you don't dispose them down your drain.
yeah,
But it's also that, in any countries, it's about how much is really being recycled, actually.
yeah. I mean, I think that there is as Yunjae mentioned, some is repurposed for animal feed. But really quickly, just to back to your earlier answer, and then earlier comments, two things. Visualization is key. You're right. I think that's actually something that I learned. I mean, I take this from Rob Nixon, who wrote the book Slow Violence, right? I mean, and that book just transformed the way I think about what does violence look like. Could be very slow over time, and it's often hidden, right? And I think slow violence definitely tells you about the need for visualization. The other thing that I would say is, I don't know about if you would show people slaughterhouses. I only say that because, and they'll change, because I was in Denmark, for example, and they eat a high percentage of pork. All right. And I went to a couple processing plants, and I saw pigs being slaughtered, and they were slaughtered really in a clean way. I mean, they were, first of all, gassed, most of them, or somehow. So you didn't see any blood, you didn't see anything. You just saw them go in, and then you saw them come out whole, right? Then, of course, I didn't see them cut up, right? So I think there's certain stages that you could see slaughtering that would push people to change. I think it's when they start seeing really blood and something very visual that really pushes people. But I 100% agree with you about this idea of visualization. But the thing I'm very skeptical about is I don't think it can come through the medium of let's say television, or I think it has to be direct, actually, about visualization of slaughter.
I think that it depends. I think it is possible through contemporary media, of television and otherwise.
Yeah.
It's how that you produce that film or whatever.
Yeah.
For example, the sounds. A lot of workers, the one that you want in Denmark is probably very humane, but in the United States, probably many industrial is not.
Yeah.
And the people work there, the sound is most disturbing.
Yeah.
Of the animal dying,
Yeah. Yeah.
And and things like that, I think if you make the film in such a powerful way, it can have a sort of impact. I do feel that potential of film to be able to carry unforgettable, impactful message to people. It's the opaqueness of the whole food industry that is really problematic. Yeah.
I mean, the last thing before I get to Jen, I think that maybe I'm more kind of pessimistic than you. I think it's a form of rupture, but then after the rupture, what happens? I think people fall back onto their old habits. That's, to me, my opinion. But I'm maybe a really pessimistic guy. That's why I think that way. But Jen, sorry, you were waiting.
Okay, so thank you so much for a very interesting talk. So my question is comes from like my total ignorance, so excuse that, please. So you were talking about scaling up, and I was wondering, as the organic farm products, consumer products become more popular, and I was wondering if it's possible for, I mean, right now the organic farming is more sort of subversive, resistive, and I was wondering if you see, as the small businesses scale up, do you see that becoming sort of corporatized and absorbed into the existing corporate culture or capitalism and so on?
Yeah, so you're in some ways similar to what we see in the United States, right? Where right, organic food movements in the 60s, 70s were very alternative, right? And then when you got into the 80s and the 90s, large scale farming corporations got into the game. And now you have Walmart and others who are able to sell it very, very cheaply. So it loses that allure or that power. I don't think, based on what I've seen, I don't think I've seen that in Korea yet. And where you've seen the corporatization of organic food. Organic food, one, is still, I mean, the interventions in the United States depended on corporate intervention, right? So you had these large farming groups. And, you know, America's different because we have to understand America has a more concentrated form of industrial farming, right? Really large scale agro farming, where you do have these businesses, large scale businesses who focus their capital on producing things and scaling up. And that's what happened with organic food in the 80s and 90s, particularly 90s and early 2000s in the United States. I don't see that equivalent in Korea, where, you know, for example, you don't have the chaebols, for example, breaking down walls to go into agriculture, right? They just don't see that as a space of profit, right? Even though if they went in, I'm sure they would scale up and destroy any organic food market, right? Like they generally do. That's what chaebols do. They go in, scale up. And I think, but you don't have that. Now, in large part, and this is from what I've known about South Korean landholding policies, you know, first of all, it's very hard for a corporation to own a large amount of land, right? I mean, there are land rules, land reform laws, remember, that were instituted in the 50s and 60s that prohibited the concentration of land holdings. And that's really in response to the 1920s and 1930s, when you had, you know, the feudal economy, peasants uprising because they didn't have land, right? And you had large landowners oppressing the peasants. So to avoid that, you have to distribute land in the 50s and 60s, but as well as make sure that no one can accumulate large amounts of land. So you don't have this type of agroeconomic system that would go in and go over and scale up organic farming. So that leaves a very nice space for groups like Hansalim to fulfill that type of role of providing organic food. You have to become a member, of course, and doing it in a way where they also have this very, I would say, very subversive message, right? It's not, it is a cooperative that is looking for social economic change. So to answer your question, I haven't seen that. And I think it has a large part to do with landholding patterns, the makeup of corporations. Now, I think Yeonji knows better about like Pulmu Corporation, right? That's a little different story, right? I mean, people associate Pulmu Hakgyo with Pulmu corporations when they're not connected to each other. And that is more kind of, you would say, more mainstream corporation, let's say, scaling up organic food, but it's not in the levels like here in the United States, for sure. Like in California, there's 3 or 4 farms in the Central and the Northern Valley that control organic farm production. I just haven't seen that in Korea, but I don't know, it would be really scary if the chaebols got into the business.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask you about the Pulmu one, so you answered my question already. Yeah, thank you.
You know, Yunjae, can you, yeah, right? I mean, I know that the Pulmu and Pulmu 1, I mean, they're totally different entities, right?
Yes, yes. They are not originally. I don't know. It's a bit complicated. So, Pulmu 학교 and 정농회, they are kind of loosely affiliated. And Won Kyung-sun, the founder of the Pulmu One, he borrowed the name Pulmu from the Pulmu school and used it for his own farm. And to sell the product from his farm, he created the company Pulmu One. So yes, but that's the initial affiliation. But as time went on, they totally became separate.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Won Kyung-sun, you know, turned it more into a corporate. I mean, it never had the intention of like a co-op, right? Pulmu 1, no.
Okay, I think we took our guest lecturer too much time. He's spent generous amount with us, and we really appreciate his presentation and taking all the questions. So yes, you know, if you have any additional desire to contact or ask him or to participate in any of the things that he does, you can always contact him at Claremont College.